What's poppin', gamers? WQQQQWRT here, and I wanted to discover, can you beat A Link to the Past without ever using your sword in the entire game? Is it actually possible to beat the game like this? 1 minute into the game, you get the sword. Well, unfortunately, at the 2 minute mark, you have to use the sword. There's no way to get past the screen without a sword. So let's make some rules for this, because I still wanted to beat the game as much as I could without using a sword. So here's the rules. If I have to use a sword, I'll use a sword. There are 500 screens in this game total, and there are 9 individual screens. You must use a sword no matter what. If I have to use a sword, I'm going to use a sword on those screens. The second rule is no dashing unless it's an item dash. When you dash, you use the sword. It's a very broken mechanic in this game. There's a glitch called an item dash where you can actually dash with an item. This has the properties of the item, not the properties of the sword. So these are legal. With that being said, let's get into the speedrun. The first dungeon is Eastern Palace, and in Eastern Palace you get the bow. The bow is pretty useful because you finally get a tool that you can use to actually damage enemies. Before this, you either had to hope the boomerang killed them, which is very few enemies, or there were pots on the screen and they damage the enemies, which is unreliable. But finally we have a bow. At the same time, most of this dungeon is designed to use the bow in the dungeon, so most of the enemies, you have to use the bow anyway, and even the boss, like, you would not want to use your sword here. It would take 5 minutes, so it makes kind of no sense to do anything except use the bow. So this dungeon is basically exactly the same. Desert is very similar to Eastern. Now, Desert was designed to be dashed through, and since we banned dashing, we have to walk through the dungeon, which makes it very tedious. Yeah, other than that, the combat's pretty much the same thing. We either walk by everything or use the bow. Even the boss Landmolas, we don't actually kill him with the sword. It's a lot faster to use the bow, so we end up using the bow on Landmo anyway. Hera was the first dungeon that was actually pretty interesting. In Hera, the first screen that was difficult was the hard hat beetle room. Your first upstairs screen, there are 3 hard hat beetles and there's 2 pots, and you need to clear the hard hat beetles to go on to the next screen. Unfortunately, in this room, there's only 2 pots, yet there's 3 hard hat beetles, and arrows don't damage these guys at all. So how exactly are you supposed to do this? Well, conveniently, a bomb will actually stun a hard hat beetle. It doesn't damage it, but it does stun it, and you can stun it into a hole, and that counts as clearing the room. So fortunately, that does work. The boss of Hera, Moldorm, you need to use a sword to clear Moldorm. You can use the hammer, but there's no way to get a hammer, so you actually have to use the sword for Moldorm. It's one of the 9 screens that you absolutely need a sword. Before going into Ganons Tower, we need 2 things. Number 1, a lot of Ganons Tower is just combat. We're going to absolutely need a bunch of arrows, so I had to pick up a ton of arrows. I also had to pick up the bug catching net. You can actually defeat Aghanim, but you need the bug catching net to do it. For some reason, the bug catching net reflects Aghanim's attack that you're supposed to need the Master Sword for. Like, how did that happen? The Master Sword is touted as this like big epic weapon that can defeat evil, and you need it to defeat Ganon. Not only do you get rid of it later in the game, but the bug catching net does as good of a job as the Master Sword. Going into Palace of Darkness, it's a fairly straightforward dungeon. The boss is pretty interesting. Helmsor, there's 2 ways to break his mask. You can either use bombs or the hammer. Neither one of those are the sword, it's not a big deal. I decided to use the hammer, I'm pretty good with it. So let's use the hammer. The second phase, you can damage his jewel with the sword, the hammer, or arrows. Now, we can't use a sword, and hitting his jewel with the hammer without a sword is very hard. So I decided to go with the arrows on the second phase. The second dungeon that you do in the speedrun, you actually do Thieves Sound. This gets you the tempered sword, and it gets you the flute, and it's right next to Palace of Darkness. Now, we're not upgrading the sword because we're not going to use the sword anyway, but we can still get the flute. So after dashing around and saving blind, we go to blind. Okay, guys, I think blind is actually a pretty hard fight without the sword. You have to use a Canis Samaria block or the hammer. The Canis Samaria block, though, I don't have. You get that in Meyer. I could go get it, but I'm already in Thieves Town. Let's just do it with the hammer. So I decided to do blind with the hammer. The hitbox of the hammer is notoriously small. Like, why couldn't they give you a bigger hammer? It's such a small hammer. In the Wind Waker, they gave you a much bigger hammer, I think, for this reason. But this hammer is incredibly small, and it's really difficult to hit blind when there's so many projectiles on screen. At any rate, we did beat it. Moving on, we go to Skullwoods. In Skullwoods, we'll see the 8th room that we absolutely need a sword in, and the last one until Ganon. You need a sword to slash through these curtains. There's 2 rooms like this in Ganons Tower as well. Going into Mothula, I want as much magic as possible. This guy is actually bugged, and guys, I don't mean that it's a bug. Yes, I know that it's a bug, but the fight itself is bugged. Sometimes your damage doesn't damage him, which means I want as much magic as possible. I'm going to use Fire Rod, and then once I run out of magic, I'm going to use the hammer. Using the hammer on this guy, it's not fun because the hammer's hitbox is so small. After defeating Mothula, we head our way over to Miserymeyer. Now, Miserymeyer, much like all of the dungeons we're going to do here, is pretty simple. The boss is a lot more challenging, though. This playthrough is pretty hard. After trying to farm hearts and end up losing all my hearts, I had 2 HP going into Vitruvius, and I decided, hey, let's do it with 2 hearts. Using my bombs and tactics and arrows, I was able to get through the fight without that much difficulty. Bombs and arrows can damage the small eyeballs, but you really want to save the arrows because you want 8 arrows on the big eyeball. This guy is so difficult without the arrows. Now, this fight's pretty hard because each one of these small eyeballs does 4 hearts of damage. So if I did damage by anything, I'm dead. Why exactly do these eyeballs do 4 hearts of damage? Like, I have no idea. The lightning does 2. The big eyeball does 2. Why do the small eyeballs do 4? Can anybody see why these eyeballs are so powerful? Jeez, not me, dude. Anyway, I get through the small eyeballs. I shoot him 5 times with my arrow, and I finish him off with the hammer. Ice Palace is a no-brainer dungeon, so we got through that, no problem. And then we're fighting Cold Stare. Now, if you have extra magic, this fight's a lot easier, or if you have a green potion or bombos, none of which I have. I'm not really interested in that stuff. I'm just going to do it with the hammer. You can damage this guy with the Fire Rod. It's way easier, but I have no magic after breaking his ice shield. So I have to do this fight with the hammer. This is probably the hardest fight to do with just the hammer because these guys' movement patterns is so erratic, and you have to worry about the falling ice. On top of that, they have a ton of HP for some reason, and they do 4 hearts of damage for some reason. So using the hammer to kill these guys is pretty difficult. I got really lucky here. Maybe I'm just an alpha gamer. Maybe that's what's going on. At any rate, I barely even took damage. Pretty easy fight. The next fight is Argus. This fight's actually super easy to do. It's just kind of long and tedious. You have to pull 1 hook shot, switch to hammer, and then kill it with the hammer, and then switch back to hook shot for every single puff. Like, dude, this sucks. So it's not even hard. Like, Argus moves really slow. Sometimes you can hammer 2 puffs at the same time, but ultimately this fight just takes forever. It's a lot easier with the sword. You can just hook shot that slash. On the last phase, you can use the arrow, fire or ice rod, the hammer. I went with the fire rod. Like that, the arrow's not gonna work. Okay, the bow and arrow is so bad for killing this guy. It takes forever. It's hard to hit, as heck to hit. The ice rod's like a bad fire rod, and then the hammer is impossible to hit as well. So yeah, the fire rod actually kills him pretty effectively. Turtle Rock was the first dungeon that was actually difficult. None of the dungeons were any hard at all. Turtle Rock, on the other hand, definitely was an upgrade in difficulty. There's a lot of screens that you wanted to dash through, or that it would have been nice to have a sword, and I just didn't have the option. Trinex as a boss himself is no easy feat. Killing him with only the hammer, fire, and ice rod is way harder than it looks. The game expects you to have a pretty powerful sword at this point, and you don't have anything, so it's rather difficult to do anything here. When any part of this boss is exploding, you cannot menu, which is a problem because you can only damage the guy with a hammer, and you need the hammer out to damage him, but you need the fire or ice rod to damage the other head. So as you kill one of the heads, you have to immediately menu. If you don't do this, the fight gets way harder. The guy's constantly attacking you. You're trying to like dodge, dip, duck, dive, and dodge. With some finesse and some good strategies, I was able to get through Trinex. Ganons Tower was way harder than every other dungeon. I thought Turtle Rock was kind of hard. Ganons Tower was clearly way harder. Like, there was no question. The Gauntlet was particularly hard. Most of the rooms in Ganons Tower, they just expect you to kill a bunch of enemies. And without a sword, you have to be a lot more creative about how you kill these, and you have to be way more conservative with your HP. A lot of the rooms later on in Ganons Tower are on ice, and there's a bunch of enemies moving towards you. And so if you do not have good HP, you're gonna take damage here. There's not much you can do about that. The other problem is Aghanim 2. Aghanim 1 was easy with the net. Aghanim 2 with the net is really difficult. There's 3 guys attacking you constantly at a different rhythm from different angles. The way the net works, it ends up being very difficult to actually hit him with the projectiles. So using the net here with low HP almost guarantees that you're gonna die. You have to be able to conserve your HP. So Ganon's Tower ended up being really hard. I actually died here on Ganon the first time I had 2 HP. I'm like, sweet, we got to Agon him too. Like, this is it. Boom, there's nothing I can do. This was actually a challenge. Before going into Ganon, I need to get some stuff. I have to get some arrows, some silver arrows. We have to use the sword on Ganon, and you can kill Ganon with the sword. But I decided to minimize the sword as much as I can, so we went ahead and got some silver arrows. And for the Ganon fight, basically, I didn't have the Tempered Sword here. I only had the Master Sword. The Master Sword's pretty hard on this fight. You have to do 12 spins on phase 1 and phase 2. The Trident does 4 hearts of damage. Ganon's body does 8 hearts of damage. Like, this is not easy at all. And then on top of that, you can only damage him with spins. Regular slashes don't work on Ganon with the Master Sword. You have to spin him. So much for calling it the Master Sword. It sucks. Anyway, guys, 2 hours, 44 minutes and 20 seconds. Not a bad run. I thought this would be a lot faster than it was and a lot easier. Actually was pretty challenging. Was a lot longer than I expected. This is a pretty fun challenge run. Obviously, you do have to use the sword, which kind of ruins it. But hey, it was pretty fun at any rate. Thanks for watching, gamers. If you want to become an alpha gamer and rise up against Ganon, make sure to subscribe. I'll see you guys tomorrow.